Welcome to the 2019 ACLS webinar series. The Association of Consultants for Liturgical Space is a voluntary membership organization of professionals dedicated to the creation of beautiful worship spaces for faith communities. This webinar series is part of our commitment to providing mutual professional support and continuing education for our members. I'm Paul Baribeau of Growth Design Group. I'm the webinar facilitator for the ACLS webinar committee, and it's my pleasure to facilitate today's webinar. Today's speaker is John Thomas West. John is the founder, artistic director, and primary choreographer of the Valyermo Dancers, a dance theater company whose mission is the preservation and translation of biblical narrative and poetic traditions into contemporary dance. Writer, lecturer, and educator at the international and national collegiate and university levels, John facilitates and designs thematic sacred dance workshops throughout the year. John serves on the Sacred Dance Guild Board of Directors, as well as on the LA Religious Education Congress Liturgy Committee. And he is a member of the North American Academy of Liturgy. Welcome to our webinar series, John. We're looking forward to hearing what it is you have to present.
Thank you. And good morning to everyone. Thank you for joining me and tuning in to this program that I've been invited to participate in. Technology, there we go. The technology is up and running now. I want to thank Paul and Father Gilbert, and I want to thank the Divine Word Fathers here at WordNet Productions in San Bernardino, Father Sony and Father Bijou, for making sure that I can do this and to have all the materials that I need to connect with you. This morning is an exciting time for me to do this presentation, Sacred Space, Body, Movement, and Worship. It's something that is truly near and dear to me, but it provided me a completely different opportunity to go back and review both my own personal experience and that of the company over the years, and to relate it back to a sister art, architecture, which is really important because dance is much more than anything else, not a visual art, but an architectural art, because what we do is carve space and to define space through movement. I want to start by looking at this presentation from the dancer's perspective. I know that, you know, every artist is very possessive about their particular artistic discipline, but from our point of view, dance is the mother of the arts, where music and poetry exist in time, and painting and architecture in space, but the dance lives at once in time and space, that we are both the creator and the instrument that is worked upon. Rhythmical patterns of movement, the plastic sense of space, the vivid representations of a world seen and imagined. These things humans create in their own bodies in the dance before they use substance and stone and word to give expression to their own inner experiences. I always tell people who come to my workshops that you danced before you did anything else, right there in your mother's womb. That movement is really important. The, hold on, there we go. The overview of what we're going to do today is in these four, shall we say, movements. We're going to look at the historic foundations of movement in theater and Christian churches. The topic I was given was to bridge both dance and theater in terms of looking at performing arts in the context of worship. I want to think about, or actually have you think about, the balance between the sacred and the profane versus the sacred and the secular, to question the nature of whose church we're talking about and whose culture, and to realize that this presentation is really going to focus on the Western story of the worship experience. We're going to look, of course, because of your discipline, at places for doing worship, the human phenomenon of liturgy and worship, the democratization of sacred space. And that's a big topic these days in terms of looking at all of the public spaces or organizational spaces, I think, as they've been redefined within the past, let's say, 50 to 60 years, and worship as a tool for equity and social justice. Next, I'm going to share with you, and it'll be the last of the visual presentations on this this particular presentation I'm sharing with you of how I and the Valyermo Dancers have navigated the spaces of various church settings. And then hopefully your questions will help me talk about visions for the future, or help us discuss visions for the future of sacred space and architecture. The foundations of movement and theater in Christian churches, really in Western society, gets us back to the core of the birth of theater and dance in ancient Greece. And this is a beautiful picture of Epidaurus, and looking at the orchestra down at the bottom, the space of the dance, which really is what that term means, and recognizing that not only was this a theater space, a gathering space of the population, this was also a sacred space. This was a space of worship where the rites of Dionysus were celebrated on a regular basis, and all came understanding that what they were witnessing was a part of a religious experience, both by intent and hopefully by their integration into their own psyches and their lifestyles. Dancers and actors were seen at that time as ministers of worship, and I think that that's perhaps a new perspective for many. Actors and members of choruses in the dramatic presentations in a city like Dionysia were paid performers, but as ministers of the god Dionysus, they were nonetheless held in a high regard. The term professional was a dirty word back in ancient times, and basically because the professionals were seen as people who came from classes that were not worthy classes. They were slaves, they were freemen, they were foreigners, but even with those attributes, there was a social justice aspect to the arts, in that liturgy could mitigate their status in that way and gain them a level of respect. The Artists of Dionysus, a union, believe it or not, with religious overtones from the 3rd century BCE, had its own shrine where at annual meetings there were sacred ceremonies. It is not until the Roman period that we get this decline in the respect, especially for dance and theater, when it takes on a more social dance perspective rather than dance as ritual. But it's because the dancers and the actors served in the process of liturgy and worship that they gained a certain level of respect prior to that time, and for some few, even thereafter. Dance developed into spoken drama and resembled, perhaps we're told, more of what we know as opera. Everyone says opera is total theater, and that's probably true because it incorporates all three of the elements here: the spoken word, but it's sung, we have music, and of course the dance. Thespis, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides were both poets and choreographers, and that's something that I don't think people generally know. They would have been my most near colleagues in the past. They were artistic choreographic fellows, in a sense, looking to underscore through the dances and their tragedies the emotional setting of the plot, or to heighten the drama in what I perceive and understand as the liturgy of tragedy. It is motion and emotion. It is rhythm and motion, all being pulled into and to accent the value of the words. And it makes us remember that words without gesture are simply minimalized communication. We need to see all of that happening together. So dance in this particular aspect can be understood and seen as this rather large scale gesture that attempts to put layers on the communication that is being delivered, and to direct the hearers and the audiences in our perspective, the assemblies, towards a particular end goal. In regards to architecture, ruins on the island of Crete, built perhaps around 2000 BCE and 1500 years before the Greeks built their Dionysian theater, exist and tell us a lot about the importance of um, these spaces, these sacred gathering spaces for all of us. We are looking at perhaps capacities of about 400 to 500 people in what are the oldest playhouses that are known in Western civilization. And I think that there's some interesting parallels here to look at. If we look at the left-hand side of the screen and the right-hand side of the screen, I think that you see the liturgy that we understand and are familiar with in our practice, really hearkening back to antiquity. That in the Emilia, the dance of tragedy, there's the entrance song and movement after the parados, the chorus reacting visibly to the dramatic episode that is about to be presented. And of course, we are very conscious of setting the tone in the gathering song and the procession. We have choral odes in antiquity that can be connected or reflected, I think, in the choral antiphons or hymns, or perhaps even by the psalm. The choragus, the leader of the dance, invites the deity to lead the procession in the dance of tragedy. And to think about, especially in contemporary times, the rise of the importance of the procession of the book of the Gospels, or the procession of the Gospel, where through representation, the deacon or the presider brings the word of God and invites God into the presence of the assembly to speak or to be heard in his sacred voice. That procession is an invitation for everyone to be involved either visually or sometimes again by representation. And then lastly, the Exodus, or what we know as the recessional or the sending forth, in which we take what we've heard, we take what we have experienced, and are challenged to take it out into the world, to make it our own, and hopefully to share it with others. People spend a lot of time in talking about the opposition to dance in worship, and certainly I think one can't deny it, it's been there. But I think it's important to look at the patristic support for dance and worship over the years as well. And so these particular men are favorites of mine, because they give me a great sense of support for what I'm doing and what I have done, and its linkage back to antiquity in the context of the church. So whether it's St. Gregory Thaumaturgus, St. Epiphanius of Salamis, St. Basil of Caesarea, St. Gregory Nazianzus, St. Gregory of Nyssa, St. Ambrose of Milan, St. John Chrysostom. Notice though in that list, there's only one Westerner. That's St. Ambrose. And it is a matter of looking at a kind of, I'll say, cross-cultural or intercultural understanding of the expression of worship that the East, our quote unquote Oriental brothers and sisters, were far more comfortable and less skittish about embracing movement as a part of their worship experience than those in the West. And some of that is because of the decline of the Roman Empire, and certainly what Augustine saw as he moved from North Africa into the continent and saw some pretty shocking stuff happen. Um, I think it's telling that a North African, and we don't normally think of this, but this is what we would today consider a mixed race man from North Africa, leaving the uh, the climate and the sultry and passionate cultures of North Africa and moving into Europe, bearing a real affinity for a faith that he uh, has committed himself to, and seeing that perhaps how life had been lived and celebrated in North Africa really wasn't something that could translate well into the Roman Empire. And so, for understandable reasons, he raised objections, especially as he saw some of his close friends sort of begin to be um, degenerated by the culture of the time. Another aside, St. Gregory of Nyssa has been recently um, sort of embraced as a patron for a church in the Bay Area around San Francisco. There's a church, an Episcopal church called St. Gregory of Nyssa, and they have in fact made as a part of the liturgy of St. Gregory of Nyssa the dance, the movement of the entire congregation, and it's something that's really um, impressive and inspiring to both witness and to participate in. And we were privileged at the Academy to have that particular liturgy as a part of our worship experience some years ago. Thinking on this conflict between East and West and this division of the human experience, if you will, we can also look at what has been discussed as the tension between Apollo and Dionysus as the uh, religious, if you will, um, sort of um, gods of the culture that we have inherited. Apollo being recognized frequently as the most Greek of the gods because he was the most heady, and Dionysus, I think, falling into a bad rap in terms of being seen as only a god of wine and debauchery. But really, it's not that at all. What we're looking at is through the lens, I believe, of Platonic or Neoplatonic thinking, that neat division that says there had to be this separation between the soul and the body. And we now know, hopefully by experience and common sense, that you can't have one without the other. They both have to come together. And this has been the thinking of liturgists and people of religious studies over the years. Much of what I'm sharing with you here is from Marianne Mick's The Future Present, which was really a grounding text for me. But I love these particular quotations because I think they direct themselves towards our particular topic. The mystery of love, which the Christian sacrifice figures forth, makes the terms Apollonian and Dionysian almost interchangeable with agape and eros. Sacrifice seems to M.C. Darcy, a Roman Catholic priest, always to be an expression of man's two loves, this love of the soul and the love of the passion. In fact, I think it's important to recognize that we have just left a season in which we celebrate ostensibly the passion of our Lord. There is this deep, rich, passionate love that Jesus had for us and that we have and we share with him for our own salvation of our humanity. But Why should not mankind speak again in its most ancient language of the great mystery of movement and counter-movement, the one which proceeds from this world to God, and the other movement which proceeds from God to this world? That's Mix quoting Gerardus Vanderloo. And I think that our initial language is that language of movement, the one that I referred to at the beginning when I said, your mom knows when you were in her womb because you had a communication system going back and forth. You'd turn and kick and she'd tap and smile and find other ways of responding back to your movements to let you know that you weren't alone and to support you as you grew into your complete human self. Guardini, the author of The Spirit of the Liturgy, defined play, and that's an important aspect to think about for us as well, as life pouring itself forth without an aim. The labor of artist, the play of children, and the public work or liturgy of worshipers are all of the same order. They are ends in themselves. They are purposeless, but meaningful. And the human body is fundamental to all these experiences. We can't just do this in our mind. The human subject is always an incarnate subject. I, you, I, don't wear a body. We are embodied, and all our relationships to the world are bodily relationships. So let's look at this transition for a moment in terms of thinking about ritual and architecture as a place to house ritual. This particular quote by Philip Wheelwright I find fascinating and also something that reflects itself back in the historical structures of worship over the years. It says, two or more children avoiding the cracks in the sidewalk. That's ritual. So let's look at places for doing worship. From home to institutional bulwark and beyond, remembering that it wasn't until Constantine that the building of churches was even allowed or promoted. The celebration of the Eucharist and the sacred rites was done at home with families in the most intimate of spaces, where again, both agape and eros were present. We began to put the worship context into these large, monolithic and very impressive structures as a way of giving it substance and validation, both by the government and later by the organized church as it continued to grow. And as we looked at the reforms of the liturgy, we thought about returning perhaps back to the intimacy of the home. But maybe we don't have to go that far. Maybe the question is, how do we make people feel that they are in the house of their Father, in God's home, within our churches, that we can be ourselves, our most human selves, within these sacred spaces, and to acknowledge that our family lives, our relationships with one another, the rituals that we share in the work of the people in liturgy is in fact all sacred. So we're going to look at avoiding the cracks in the sidewalk from a historical perspective. There's a rule for play, regardless of what the game is. And here we have the Cathedral of Reims. Three views, again, looking at this magnificent structure and its exterior, a place of beauty, and it draws us inside because of the way that it's constructed and articulated. But inside, it's got space for movement. Look at all that dramatic and wonderful space around the altar. And it also has one other thing, a labyrinth. And the labyrinth was a place, literally, for the game. Sometimes it was a ball game that was led, a pelota, an actual ball, that was moved through the space by the bishop He was the courageous, he was the dance leader who would lead a procession throughout these kinds of structures and ending up in the center, which is where we would find the win, the goal. We would find our reconnection with the resurrection, which was usually the perspective about the center of the labyrinth. Here's another place for doing worship and watching the rules of play, the cathedral at Chartres. Again, the towers, curious, because again, we see two asymmetrical visions of these stretches of the building up towards heaven. The nave view, which is long and narrow, suggesting already that getting to the altar is a process within itself, a movement of itself, which we should treasure. And again, a labyrinth. A labyrinth that you walk into at the very beginning of your experience of the Cathedral of Chartres. The diagram on the bottom, or bottom right, is actually the diagram of this labyrinth, but you can see people navigating this labyrinth in the picture above it. Recognize that the church with the labyrinth, both here at Chartres and also at Reims, was an opportunity for people to come and to meditate and to be engaged with the deity and themselves and the faith and ritual when in fact they were not necessarily coming to the Mass, but simply needed to be in the house of God. And I think that that's really an important aspect of this thought as well. I want to hold in mind this notion of the asymmetry of the two towers too, because here I think we're finding a bridging of time, a bridging of history, and a bridging perhaps of even cultures, as the time to construct these magnificent uh, buildings stretched over long periods of history, and people changed as they saw what beauty was and how they saw their relationship to God. And it reflected itself, obviously, in the architecture and in the worship experience as we knew it. Within the rules of play, and I want to come back for a moment, notice again that when we're looking at the cathedral at Reims, there's not a lot of pews here, right? It's not stayed, it's not constrained. There's places for people to stand or to sit if they choose, perhaps in chairs, but they are engaged in a different way that is movable, a movable feast, literally. Same thing here. You can see the chairs in this shot of the nave uh, for Chartres. The space is plastic. It has a movability that is suggested and very real. In the early days of the Middle Ages and even during the early part of the Renaissance, the worship experience was very often a sequence of movements and dances that were done by different um, classes of people, including the clerical class, as they came to engage with one another and to experience the koinonia, the metanoia, excuse me, that we are called to be as Christians, that sense of blessed community that has to move. And one of the classic movements was what we call the tripudium. You take 2 steps forward and 1 step back, because that's the nature of our progress in faith. We never go directly ahead, full speed ahead. It's 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Here's a new place to look at. Again, it's so magnificent. I haven't been able to find a complete, full picture of the Cathedral of Seville, any place. But one place where the dances of the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance existed and sustained themselves was here in Spain. Again, that tension between East and West. Southern Spain is a place that has certainly its own savors and culture, but it didn't end up quite as rigid or as separated from the Eastern roots of the church as some of the other places on the continent. You can tell that both by the architecture itself, by the language and language development, but this dance, the Baile de los Seis, is one that held on even when it was protested by the local prelate. This is the dance of the sixes that was done by 6 male or boy leaders. It typically is done during the Lenten season, um, but it's celebrated in other times as well as this dance of celebration before the altar of the Virgin, and a variety of other situations. One of the local prelates back in the, I think, 16th century or so, protested and wanted it banished. And so the people of Spain and Seville said, okay, we'll see about that. And so they sent these boy dancers to Rome and had them perform before the Pope. And the Pope said, I see nothing to not recommend the presentation of these boy dancers and the beauty of their prayer to ban them from the cathedrals. So the Pope actually gave his consent for this dance to survive as it did for a number of centuries. And it's been a draw to the city of Seville, especially during Holy Week, for a long time. So let's branch out. Places for doing worship. And I took these insights from Peter Fan, not to be confused, on postmodern religion and worship. Peter Fan is a professor of liturgy and worship and theology, actually, at Georgetown, having moved from Catholic University to Georgetown. It's important to recognize that Peter Fan is also a professor who brings with him a cultural perspective that's important for us to be conscious of as we read and engage in what he shares with us. He is Vietnamese. So he's come from Vietnam to the mainland here, the United States, and is looking through a very special lens. He tells us, especially within this point of view about postmodernism, that postmodernism was initiated in architecture and the arts, and it rejects modernity's preference for stylistic integrity and purity. Remember those 2 towers back at the Cathedral of Chartres? And exposes instead heterogeneity and polyvalence, bricolage and pastiche, and an eclectic mixture of disjointed and contradictory elements. That didn't used to be the case for us, huh? We used to always think that everything has to be about balance, about looking at reflection from one side to the other. He says, in contrast to modern architecture, which in the wake of Frank Lloyd Wright emphasizes organic unity and practical functionality, typified by the nearly universal pattern of glass and steel boxes, postmodern architecture makes use of a variety of incompatible historical styles, forms, techniques, and materials. By accentuating pluriformity and hybridity, postmodern architecture wants to show that behind the principle of organic unity and practical the function of modern architecture lies the dehumanizing and uniformity of standardized mass production. In other words, we don't want to be things. We don't want to be objectified. We want to embrace the full irregularity of what it means to be human and to bless all of it as we move towards our experience of art and our experience of faith and our experience of worship. So postmodernism's first challenge regards the concept of enculturation itself. If the gospel, and more specifically the liturgy, must be regarded as a cultural symbolic world, a social construct with its own interests and idiosyncrasies, then enculturation is not an incarnation of a timeless, unchanging, and acultural reality, such as the eternal logos, into a particular culture, but an intercultural encounter or dialogue between at least 2 cultures, and probably a lot many more, given that we live in especially this country, but I believe globally, in a world where the notion of any particular majority has now begun to sunset, and that we see that we are made up of a variety of different inputs, backgrounds, and possibilities. It brings me to the experience of my dance company and of me as a sacred dancer. Paul beautifully explained at the opening of this presentation that we have a mission that is the preservation and translation of biblical narrative and poetic traditions into contemporary dance. Our home is actually a Benedictine monastery here in the high desert of Southern California. None of us lives there. We all live within a far-flung distance, both north and south of the Abbey, but it's still the place of our spiritual grounding and where the vision of dance as an expression of faith and worship really grew for all of us who are members of this company. I mounted our first full-length ballet called God's Troubadour at the Abbey in 1977. It was done in an amphitheater, believe it or not, on the monastery grounds, but our mentor at the time, Father Vincent Martin, said, John, your challenge is not to perform where everyone embraces you, but to take it out into the world and into places where it would not necessarily be welcomed in exactly the same way. So on your right is the dance version or picture of the dance version of the tonsure with St. Francis of Assisi on one side, St. Clare on the other, and Lady Poverty in the middle as the order began to grow after after Francis's rise of his own spirituality. We took it from the amphitheater in the high desert and put it in this Romanesque church in the city of Los Angeles. This is St. Cecilia's. It is the only Romanesque Byzantine church in the Archdiocese, and you see it in its regular function down below the facade there. But I'm going to share with you some of what the challenge was to put it into motion and to make it work as a place for performance. This is the haircutting for St. Clare. That was done obviously before the now modernized version of the church, with the altar moved forward from its original position. On the left is the dance of the lepers, led by Lady Poverty and Lady Love, coming into the space, and on the right, that celebration of God being present with them and this energized presence that St. Francis would need to embrace. And lastly, Francis embracing one of the lepers as one of his acts of faith and trust in the presence of God. Let's move from there to a very sort of modern church. This is St. Jane Frances de Chantal in North Hollywood, California. These pictures were taken back around the same time in the mid-70s, and this was on the Feast of Pentecost. So on the right, the black and white or sepia tone picture is the dance of Holy Flaming, which we did just in front of the altar there. More importantly for me, though, I want you to see that the church space needed to be raked in a way that the assembly could see what the dancers were doing and that the dancers could help engage the assembly in gesture prayer. And so on the left and right bottom of the screen are pictures of the assembly as they prayed in gesture the universal prayer. God the Father, hear our prayer. Hear us, God the Son. Holy Spirit, hear our prayer. Mercy on your people, Lord. And we were blessed to have, again, the members of the clergy standing behind us and supporting us throughout this liturgy. This is our home. This is the chapel, actually an old barn that was originally on the grounds of a place called um, Hidden Springs Ranch. This barn became the chapel for the Benedictine monks who founded it. They were Belgians. And inside that chapel, we have done a variety of different things, but this is the picture of the company dancing to Mahler's Second Symphony. This was on the occasion of the 50th Jubilee of our um, spiritual director, Father Philip Edwards. You'll notice again the tightness of the space. It's a challenging space to move, and the number of dancers with whom the space had to engage and provide some opportunities. So in the left bottom, you see us actually at the processional, but you'll see of this particular piece, and you see how spread out the dancers were in the front. You see us before the altar on the right, but you get some sense of the dimension of the space with me in that photo at the top. This is from a church that was known as West Hollywood Presbyterian Church. It no longer is a Presbyterian church, it's the United Church of Christ. But the interior of the church hasn't changed very much. Yes, it has pews, but you notice that the table for the sharing of the communion has been moved aside, and it's been provided an open space for the experience of movement and dance. These are pictures of myself and Marge Champion, again, back in the day when I had hair and was much younger, dancing in two very different worship experiences. On the right, we're dancing Morning is Broken, a hymn that's pretty standard that I don't think people normally see within the context of dance. And on the left and the bottom, we are the two of the Magi, we three kings in that context. This probably at this point is my favorite place to perform as company. This is the chapel of Holy Spirit Retreat Center, run by the Sisters of Social Service, who share the Benedictine spirituality of our brothers back at Valyermo. The exterior, you see, it's architecturally, I think, unique and sculptural in the way that it makes its presence known. Interiorly, the sense of space, of light, of freedom, really, is unique. And so you see it here as it's normally dressed or prepared for the day-to-day experience of retreatants and the retirement community of the Sisters of Social Service. It's in Encino, California. Here we are at liturgy at the chapel. And again, the point I wanted to make at the very top picture is we are leading worship through gesture, and again, it's at the universal prayer with all of those who are gathered here, and again, it's on the Feast of Pentecost. The arms lifted are people in chairs behind us, around us, in front of us, but we become like our ancestors in this Western tradition, the leaders of worship. Down on the bottom right, I and one of my dancers can be seen with a more close-up picture of what we're doing and how it's being impacted or inviting others to move around us. And on the left is the Dancing the Song of Thanksgiving, in which all of the company participated. It transforms itself beautifully into a performance space with a stage and with lighting and the opportunity to have an audience sit before us for a concert. And this is O Mary, Mother Magnified, which is the sort of last piece or one of the last most recently choreographed pieces of our winter concert which is a dancing festival of lessons and carols. So, Paul, I'm going to turn it back to you and see if I've got some questions and some thoughts that you want to perhaps engage here. I hope it did better with my running time this time than I did the first. And yes, I can do that. Paul. Can you hear me? Well, I'm going to continue to talk for a little bit while Paul helps me engage my webcam. I keep saying share my webcam, and I don't see much happening here, and I don't see him for the moment, but I'm sure it's going to come up shortly. Hello. One of them, while I'm waiting for this to sort of reconnect, one of the things that I want to plant as a seed, perhaps, is the notion that inside these houses of worship are places to do worship. If we're going to be inside, brick and mortar buildings, I think it's really important that we consider two things that are important to. There we go, I think. Hi. Two things that I think are important to the performing arts. One, as I said before, is to think about having raked seating and or a raked center for the altar setting, what we would otherwise call stage, because despite the fact that dance is very architectural, and despite the fact that our job is to carve shapes into the space that we're moving, it's also important that we can be seen. And if you can't see, it sort of defeats the entire purpose. So that's why places like the chapel at Holy Spirit and the chapel or the church at West Hollywood were so inviting, because they provided all of that, an elevated space for performance and an elevated opportunity for the assemblies to see us. That was also the case of St. Jane Frances, even back in the earlier mid-70s, because the altar and what they called the terrazzo were all raised well above the seating level of the assemblies, so that they weren't just looking at kneecaps for us or arms, they were looking at a full body expression that way. Paul, I need your voice. Hello. Technology is the other thing to think of while we're at it. It's really important that enough technology is built into our new houses of worship, not just for the sake of making sure that the speakers are on and that the presider can be heard and all that other good stuff, but that you can see and hear all of what's going on in and around the church settings. So whether it's a processional or whether it's an opportunity for some other choral or performing arts presentation, it's really critical that screens be set up, especially if the sight lines are blocked, so that everyone has an equal opportunity to see and to be seen. Flooring. Marble's gorgeous. It's beautiful, but it speaks of an opulence and a kind of, um, I'll say, setting that was most appealing to the wealthy and not necessarily to those more common folk who wouldn't have marble in their homes. That's not to say that it doesn't have its place, but especially for the performing artist, think this way. It's slick. If it gets wet, whether you're acting or dancing, you can upend yourself and end up on the floor with a serious injury, and it's not really attractive. Um, it provides sometimes real challenges in terms of lighting, which is another element that I think needs to be considered within the context of the new church buildings, so that lighting can be cast in a broad range of possibilities, so that we can see uh, everything, everyone in that way.
John, can you hear me now?
I can now. Thank you.
I think I had a microphone issue here on my end. We do have some questions. So
Okay.
thank you so much for continuing to share things while I was inadvertently muted. So one of our members asked at the LA Congress, you use the space at liturgy to dress the altar, bring the gifts, etc. What goes into your thought process as you look at the space you have to work within?
Depends upon the space. There are some really challenging spaces in the convention center because, as you know, we have the arena, which is probably the most ideal in quotation marks, because we have the most space in terms of both aisle space and visuals. We've got those screens up, they're the jumbotrons that show everything. But what's important is that I have the opportunity to include, and that's a challenge, to include the sometimes 30 to 40,000 people that are sitting in that space. So I need them to be able to see and to feel involved in the procession of the elements that are brought for the table dressing. We usually try to dance in cultural cloths that represent the spread of the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, so that we visually or symbolically show that this is a welcome table. This is the table for all to feel as though they can dine, they can sup with the Lord. So we dance in sometimes those cloths, whether it's at the arena or in the convention center ballrooms or at Hall B, which is the gathering space for the Spanish liturgy. Different ones, different ministers of movement do this differently, and we have different groups who do this at Congress. After you lay those bottom layers of fabric on, then comes the overlayer, the statement of unity, that we are all bound together in our one faith. And so we bring up the white altar cloth that goes on top of those cultural cloths. It's important that the cultural cloths are long enough that they can show on the borders of the altar, and yet at the same time to see that white cloth as this sort of billowing fabric that comes forward and really provides that kind of unification for everyone. And then hopefully either with the assistance of the ministers of movement or with members of the assembly to set the table for the feast. So we bring the corporal and the chalice and of course the offertory itself with the wine and the bread and everything. Big controversies about bringing the bread up in baskets because, again, is it worthy enough? Do we need metal vessels so that it shines and looks rich enough? But again, there are those of us who come from cultures where the shiny stuff isn't a part of our experience. So baskets are very, very rich. And you stop and think about how much you want to pay for an original indigenous basket of either Native American or other background. It's pretty wealthy.
So we have a comment from Gilbert, who you know. He loved the presentation and especially the insight on the movement space at the entry of the church, especially the labyrinth. He's asking, are there other elements at the entry to the church that can remind people of movement and pace?
Well, yes, again, to look at, I think, the distance that one provides between the entrance or the assembly space of the church as you enter into the door, and that it takes you some time to get to your seating area and to the altar. That that notion that it requires movement, it requires an effort, I think is really important. And to move as we have past the font and into the what we usually call the nave of the church. And if for Congress, for instance, walking past the ambo and approaching the altar, there's a church in Chicago that I've loved, Saint Benedict the African or Saint Benedict the Black, in which you actually descend from the top layer of the entrance level around a magnificent waterfall into the baptistry and then into the seating area. And boy, that drama really said it, that you have to, you have to be born again of the water. You have to die and be reborn in order to get there. So I think the symbols along the way make a big difference, both in terms of how the walking space or the entry space is formed, and what you put there as the artistic symbols that the group has to encounter. I think a small baptistry doesn't always make the point because it becomes insignificant. So making a big one is a big deal and should ring some bells for us in that way.
I was going to say, John, that we architects in our efficiency for using every bit of space to maximize seating are probably culprits in reducing movement as well. I know I always love church spaces that have ambulatories or other spaces that aren't so functional to fill up seating that it leaves room for people to move at the periphery or even in the middle of naves.
I think it's important to remember too that, especially for us here in the United States, pews became social class symbols, and that the stability of the state and the stability of the family and this a particular family and the stability of the church were recognized by the seating arrangements inside the church. And if you look back at the older churches, the notion that you had chairs that could move and to move around, and that you could reshape the worship space because you had chairs and not pews made a big difference. I've worked in churches where we could actually unscrew the pews from their bases, assuming that there's no rebar sticking out of the floor, and to move around to reshape where we could be and how we could engage the assembly. I think that that's an important thing. Even at the Abbey, we take out the first two pews of the chapel when we are in a workshop situation so that we have more ambulatory or dance space or performance space at the Abbey. And the monks are good with that. Or even for a monastic funeral in which the movement of the coffin takes a significant amount of space, and it's really impressive to see all that space around the deceased monk lying in state. So yeah, I think that's really important.
So that is all the time we have today, John. I really want to thank you for an engaging presentation.
Thank you all. Thanks so much for having me.